is Doug Cuny, and today I'm going to show you how to make your own natural bread starter. Most people make one of two types of bread. They make either unleavened bread like tortillas and flatbread, or they make leavened bread, which contains, besides the flour, the water, and the salt, an additional ingredient that causes a production of carbon dioxide, which causes the bread to rise. Now, traditionally, all leavened bread was made with a starter, which was a symbiotic colony of wild yeasts and bacteria that were maintained in a medium made from flour and water. When added to the bread dough, the colony would feed on the starches and sugars in the flour, and through fermentation would produce lactic acid, acetic acid, traces of alcohol, and the all-important CO2 that causes the bread to rise. By the 1930s, baker's yeast had been developed from brewer's yeast. Like baking soda and baking powder, it was fast-acting and it could be stored dry, but it was made from one single super strain of yeast. These modern products were fast, but baking is kind of like sex. Just because you're fast doesn't mean you're good. Natural fermentation takes a lot longer than the modern option, but each one of those byproducts produced by fermentation has its own individual flavor. So naturally fermented bread has a much wider flavor profile than any other kind. In order to make your own starter, you're going to need several items. A scale, a few assorted bowls, a spatula of some sort, whole wheat flour, rye flour, preferably organic, and filtered water. You'll also want a container with a tight-fitting lid that you can punch a tiny hole in. You're going to want to try to exclude as much oxygen from your starter as possible, but you want to make sure that the production of CO2 doesn't blow the lid off. Thus, the tiny little hole functions as like a safety valve. You'll be using whole wheat flour because it ferments quickly. You'll want to use organic rye flour because a lot of the wild yeasts and the bacteria that you want to develop your culture actually live on rye grain. So let's get started. First, you're going to want to take your whole wheat flour and your rye flour and mix it in 50-50 proportions. I usually like to do that in advance, and then I put it in a large container and leave it on the counter, and I can use it right out of this container. First, you're going to weigh out 100 grams of your whole wheat and rye flour mixture and 100 grams of filtered water. You mix those two together. Until all of the dry flour is absorbed. And then you just put that mixture right in your container. Don't be afraid to use your hands. This isn't a sterile science project. Now, you take the lid that you've punched a tiny little hole in and you seal it up. The ideal temperature for making your starter is between 60 and 65 degrees. That's a comfortable temperature for the culture, but it's a little bit cool for the bacteria that actually cause spoilage. The ideal place in most houses is the basement, but if you don't have any place that cool in your house, don't worry about it. Just keep an eye on your starter, and if something fuzzy starts growing on it, you're going to want to throw it out and start over. So at this point, you've got your starter in its container and it's all mixed. You're going to want to put it aside in a cool spot for 48 hours. After a couple days, your starter is going to look pretty much like it did to begin with, but don't let that fool you. There's a culture starting to grow in here, and you're going to want to feed it to make it stronger. So what you're going to do is you're going to take about half of your starter and you're going to throw it out. And then you're going to make another 200 gram mixture of flour and water. You're going to add that to your starter, mix it up, put the lid back on it, put it back in its cool spot, and leave it for 24 hours. After another 24 hours, you're going to do exactly the same process. You're going to take half of your starter, throw it away. Make a new 200 grams of your flour water mixture, feed your starter, seal it up, put it back in its cool spot, and you'll check it in another 24 hours. All right, at this point you're at about day 5 in the process, and you're going to begin to see something interesting. If you look at your starter, if you can actually see it, you can see that there's bubbles forming in it. Now that's a result of the fermentation producing CO2, and that's exactly what you want to see. So at this point, your starter has actually gotten a good foothold, and it's producing lactic acid within the starter medium, which makes it much tougher for bad bacteria to get a foothold. So at this point, in order to jumpstart it and get it really productive, you're going to bring it up someplace warm, let's say inside your kitchen. So at this point, you're going to do the same thing that you've been doing the last 5 days. Although you don't really need to maintain 200 grams of starter, and you can actually cut the feeding down to about 100 grams. Throw out all but about a tablespoon of your starter, feed it your 100 grams of your mixture just like you always do, and then set it someplace warm like in your kitchen. Now at this point, you could probably use your starter to make bread, but it's a good idea to really get this culture established. So I suggest going along with your regular feeding program for another week or so. And keep an eye on it, because you're going to notice some changes. As a matter of fact, right now you're just seeing small bubbles, but as time goes by over the next few days, you're going to notice that it's going to produce a lot more CO2 than it ever did before, and it's probably going to expand even up to double its size. As a matter of fact, you may run into a problem. Now this doesn't have to be a problem if you know what you're looking at. Once your starter is active and you bring it up into a warm place, you might feed it and come back 24 hours and it looks to you like it's dead. The reason for that is that now that your starter is in a warm place, it's consuming the food that you used to give it that would last for 24 hours in 12 hours or maybe even 6. The solution is to simply start feeding your starter twice a day, or even 3 times a day if your house is warm. Now at this point, you got a couple options. The first one is to do like people have been doing for generations, and that is to feed your starter every day 2 or 3 times, maybe once if it's cool in your house, and just keep baking bread. If you bake bread all the time, this is your best option. With regular feeding, your starter will get stronger and stronger and make better and better bread. Now your other option is, if you're not baking every day, is to feed it and let it sit for about an hour on the counter to get that culture started, then put it in your refrigerator. It'll actually refrigerate very well. And if you refrigerate it, it slows the fermentation down, but it doesn't stop it. So you're good for about a week before you're going to have to feed that starter again. Now what I do with my starter is I put it in the refrigerator when I'm not going to be using it, and I feed it the same day every week so that I won't forget. I take the starter out of the refrigerator the night before, leave it on the counter. So in the morning, it's active, it's bubbling, it's fermenting. I take most of it out, I throw it away, I feed it, leave it setting on the counter a little longer to activate, put it back in the refrigerator until next week. Now I've heard people say that you can't freeze starter, but the fact of the matter is I've frozen it up to 6 months. Now the ideal situation, if you can't take care of your starter on a regular basis, is to try to only freeze what you've got for maybe a month. The way that I do that is I use these little screw top jelly jars. You're going to want to take your starter and feed it. And then when it's at its most active, when it's really bubbling and starting to expand, you're going to want to put just enough to fill your jar about half full. Then you'll seal it up. You don't have to put a hole in the lid this time. And you put it in your freezer. Then when you come back and you're ready to activate it again, you take your jar out of the freezer, you put it on a counter, and it's going to take about 24 hours for it to thaw completely. At that point, take some of it and mix your flour and rye mixture and feed it, and keep an eye on it. You're going to want to feed it 2 or 3 times a day for a couple days. Then you can just go back to your regular schedule. You're going to be amazed at how good the bread you can make with natural leavening is. It's something you're going to want to do the rest of your life, and your friends are probably going to want you to do it the rest of your life. Also, now that you've got a starter, if you've got friends that are interested in baking their own bread, you can give them some of your starter, show them how to take care of it, and starter will last for the rest of your life if you continue to feed it and care for it. Now that you've got your bread starter, you can start making bread, but there's a catch. And the catch is it's not economical or even possible to keep enough starter to leaven the bread that you're going to make. So there's one intermediate step. You need to learn how to use your starter to make a larger amount of leaven, and then you'll use that to make your bread. It's not difficult. So check out the video that I've got on making natural leaven, and that will show you the intermediate step. So I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my channel, Cuny's Kitchen, and share these videos with your friends. I'm Doug Cuny. Until next time, take care.